which is talking about the macro policies, fiscal and monetary, and how we can address the issues of income inequalities. Professor Chang is right now at Indiana, but she has a PhD from Yale University. She has served as advisor to the Stone Center for Research in Wealth Inequality and Mobility at the University of Chicago and served as president of the Korea America Economic Association. Professor Chang, if you don't mind, next week just be with us in the audience. Somebody from Korea is speaking to us. I'm sure you will enjoy that presentation too. She also serves as coordinator of the Midwest Econometrics Group and co-organizer of the Symposium of Econometric Theory and Applications. Her research develops, and this is very, very important, we were just talking about it, her research develops cutting-edge time series, panel data, and machine learning methodologies to address critical economic challenges, including income inequality, our focus for today, climate change, and monetary policy effects. She has pioneered applications of functional time series and regime switching models to analyze intergenerational mobility and policy impacts on income distribution. She has published extensively. Very importantly, she has delivered keynote and invited talks at major international conferences, including the latest 2025 World Knowledge Forum, where she presented research based on the paper she is discussing with us today. So, looking forward to Professor Chang. To chair this session, which according to me is a very important session at this juncture for our country, we have invited Professor Goyal to chair the session. And as we all know, she's the advisor at EGROW Foundation. She has worked long years at IGIDR Bombay. She has also published extensively. She has been the member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council. She is also been the member of the Reserve Bank of India's Monetary Policy Committee. With this, I hand over the session to Professor Goyal to take the proceedings further. Professor Goyal, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Charan. Thank you for the introductions and for your platform and for bringing us all together here. I really think Professor Chang's work is very, very promising, as you were saying. This question of will growth raise inequality? And I think our post-pandemic experience when I was sort of involved in policy making is really that the types of policy matter. You know, if fiscal policy is reducing supply bottlenecks, reducing inflation because of that, is looking at externalities that build human capacity, infrastructure, then that kind of is the best kind of redistribution that allows incomes productivity to grow. And then you can have growth with redistribution that is sustainable. So we've had this experience the last 2-3 years after the pandemic. But as Professor Charan Singh was saying, there are people who just, that redistribution means you just, and I think the whole world has been experimenting with this. When you just make income transfers, and then the demands are endless, budgets are limited, debt increases, inflation increases, and it's not sustainable. But there is a section of people who believe redistribution first, growth is just increases inequality. You don't worry about it. So I think your rigorous work in this area, clarifying these issues, would be very, very useful to all of us. We are looking forward to listening to you. Please. So you have 45 minutes for your presentation, then we can have some discussion. Yeah, please. We're looking forward to your talk.
Okay. Thank you so much for having me here, and I really hope that my talk will answer some of the very important and timely debates and going on right now on the nexus between the growth and the inequality. So my talk will be today about monetary and the redistributive policies and their effects on income inequality. So this talk is based on my paper, How Do Macro Aggregates and Income Distribution Interact Dynamically? And this paper introduced a novel structural mixed autoregression with aggregate functional variables, which will help us answer the questions that we are interested in. And this is joint work with So-Young Kim at Seoul National University and Jun Park at Indiana. So we already heard at the beginning why we should be interested in this issue. So I was also motivated by, observing that the relationship between income distribution and aggregate macroeconomic variable has been discussed for a long time, and I want to contribute there. An obvious example is the link between inequality and economic growth, which is by now studied and debated both theoretically and empirically for decades. But some studies suggest that there's a positive relationship between inequality and growth. So if you grow, inequality will also grow. So there is a clear trade-off between the growth and equity. But in contrast, some other studies present some opposite views. However, further studies argue that the relationship is not uniform and provides mixed or context-different empirical evidences. I won't be able to go through all this literature, but there are many. But also there are previous studies that analyze the relationship between the income distribution and specific macroeconomic policies. In particular, today we'll focus on the effects of monetary policy on income distribution. And there have been many researches already published, and we find that most of them, that the contractionary monetary policy, so if you increase interest rates, that will make income inequality worse through the various channels as I show, through the unequal labor market responses or disproportionate gains in capital income. So what do we do in this paper is that we study this interaction between this income distribution and aggregate macro variables using a novel empirical framework, hoping to learn more from the data. And our framework is new, and it allows us to investigate this, important relationship more effectively and help us identify new redistributive shock, which I will be more specific down the road. And the reason we can do this is because we look at the entire income distribution, not just average income or just dispersion, or it's just simple summary statistics like Gini. So we look at entire income distribution. And to be able to do that, we'll need to introduce a new methodology, which we call a structural mixed auto regression model, which combines the conventional vector auto regression, which is used by most central banks to analyze how the aggregate policy shock, such as monetary policy shock or tax shocks or spending shock, will affect macroeconomy. But here, we're going to also need what's called functional autoregression to accommodate income distribution, which is infinite dimensional function. So now, with this methodology, now we can provide new insights to some questions people have already studied, such as effect of monetary policy on income inequality, and also interaction between income inequality and growth, such as the topic that pioneered by Piketty and others. So here, we can also explore questions that have received little attention, mainly because we don't have tools to analyze. That includes relative importance of aggregate versus distributional shocks. So you can talk about aggregate shock, meaning monetary policy shock, tax shock, or government spending shock, versus redistribution, shock to income distribution. Which one's more important, explaining what's happening in income distribution, therefore income inequality, and also what kind of role redistributive policy, public policy, play in fostering equity and growth. So more specifically, the kind of questions that we ask is to what extent do monetary policy shock drive changes in income distribution, or what proportion of aggregate fluctuations can be attributed to income distribution shock? Can income distribution shock generate recessions? Are monetary policy shock really effective tool for reducing income inequality or not? So I'm going to give you along the way empirical facts. But before we do that, let me tell you a little bit more about our model. So we're going to construct mixed autoregression model that will include both income distribution and key macro aggregate variables such as output, price levels, and the policy interest rate. So we're going to identify monetary policy shock as in the conventional way, and then we'll study their effects on this, not only on the macro variables, but also on the income distribution. And we'll also identify new shocks to income distribution, which will provide new insights on the role of income distribution and determine income distribution dynamics. So we're going to do two things. One is output maximizing shock, which is when the policymaker, the social planner, has an interest in maximizing output in the future. And I'm going to call that as a growth targeted policies. And I'll show you how exactly we identify this shock. And then another shock is inequality minimizing shock. So here in this case, policymaker is interested in minimizing inequality. So this policy target would be minimize such a Gini index, a measure of inequality like 10 years later. So here we can call this type of policy shock as equity targeted. And then once we identify these shocks, then we can study how these shocks affect the macroeconomy and income distribution. And then we're going to also do what's called forecast error decomposition to see what shocks are important, and also historical decomposition, which will allow us to know by looking at the history, during what time these shocks were more influential than others. So these are typically what's done by conventional macroeconomic studies. So our paper is showing that we can do same policy analysis even when we allow infinite dimensional income distribution instead of using just average income. So that's the contribution. So I'm going to use the data, the US data, at the both micro level and the macro level, because we need the income distribution. We have to look at disaggregate household income data. It is coming from the Consumer Expenditure Survey by Bureau of Labor Statistics, and we're going to use this cross-sectional household income data to construct income distribution. And that's going to be our functional data. And then we use usual aggregate macro variable like output price and commodity price and federal funds rate. And we look at the sample period from January 80 to December 2015. So whatever empirical facts I tell you, that is based on this data that we use. So there are more details about the income distribution, how we construct, and it is in the slides that you can look at them later. For the sake of time, let me move on and show you how the income distribution. So this is, if you look at it's on the x-axis. So you will see that this is the cross-sectionally demeaned income distribution, because in our analysis we have aggregate output, so we get rid of mean so that we can focus on the redistributed part, dispersion. And then this is over time from 1980 to 2015. And then now on the right hand side, I took out time series mean of this income distribution so that we can focus more on the fluctuation, so that you can see clearly just by looking at this cross-sectionally demeaned distribution time series, you can see that the middle class has gone down now compared to 1980, but the poor people distribution has gone up. So you can clearly see just by looking at this graph how income distribution has changed. And also you can see this bump showing us that the proportion of very rich people has increased, which is compared to 1980. So these are the things that we can just by looking at seeing that we're going to see how these kind of changes in income distribution has influences macroeconomy, most importantly, the output. So before I go on, let me tell you about what we find. So what we find is that the monetary policy's impact is actually more nuanced than simply just a mean shift or change in dispersion. And in particular, if we focus on the contractionary monetary policy, meaning the increasing interest rate, it actually worsens income inequality if we take into account the negative effect, a huge negative effect on aggregate income. As we know, if we increase interest rate, we know that output suffers, and that is also reflected in income inequality. But if you can preserve aggregate income at that level through other public policy, through fiscal policy, whatever policy that you can, so hypothetically, if you can do things so that the aggregate income is preserved, then monetary policy has actually positive redistributive effect, which I will show you explicitly. which will improve income inequality. But condition is that if we can maintain the level of aggregate income. But overall, contribution of monetary policy shock to income distribution is relatively small compared to the redistributive policy shocks. So they are significant but small. But now let's turn to the effect of redistributive policy. I told you I'm going to study two. One is the growth targeted, and the other is equity targeted. So contrary to my expectation, even though policymaker is focusing on growth, it actually decreases inequality substantially, much bigger than what the monetary policy can do. And the equity targeted, when the policymaker is interested in minimizing inequality, although we suspect that, and a lot of people worry that if you do, then growth will suffer, but I don't see that evidence, because it hurts output at the beginning, but it goes up. And overall, the effect is small and not very significant. Clearly, what I found is that there is no evidence of trade-off between growth and equality. And what we find from there is that income distribution is affected much more by this redistributive shock than the aggregate policy, the monetary policy shock. So if we want to do anything about income inequality and to improve inequality in particular, we do have to rely on redistributive policy. Aggregate policy shock, such as monetary policy shock, is not going to be enough. So let me quickly give you a brief introduction of model, because our new model is really what enables us to see all these new findings that people couldn't find before. It is technical, but let me briefly go through. So basically, we think this GT includes all the variables, the aggregate variables and income inequality, income distribution, and it evolves over time like this, the vector autoregressions. And then from this, we're going to identify structural shock, this E, which contains monetary policy shocks and redistribution shocks and price shocks and things like that. And we're going to identify what those are, and then we're going to see the effect of these structural shocks. Those are interpretable policy shocks, how that influences what's happening in the economy, both aggregate variables and income distribution. So we have a history of shocks, and this model allow us to see how those policy shocks that happened historically affects what we experience now. Typically, they have this kind of a model. So you have output, price, and the interest rate. And then people, typically conventional people before our time, they use one measure of inequality, such as Gini. And then they try to identify shocks, structural economic shocks, using some identifying restrictions. Here, I'm going to use very simple restriction. Then they can identify aggregate shock, such as unexpected change. Shocks are nothing but unexpected changes in macro variables like aggregate, unexpected changes in aggregate output, unexpected changes in inflation, unexpected changes in commodity price, unexpected change in monetary policy, which we're going to focus. And in this conventional model, they have to pick one measure of inequality. But here, our invention is that instead of using one measure of inequality, we're going to include entire income distribution, which is why we need new model now, which includes vector autoregression to study the usual aggregate variables, output prices and interest rates and things like that. And then we need functional autoregression so that we can include this income distribution FT, which represents income distribution. So dealing with the variable, which is infinite dimensional, is hard, but our methodology will allow us to study that. Basically, infinite dimensional things are hard to do. So basically we're going to convert this infinite dimensional functional problem into something finite, and then we can study this in this easy space, and then we're going to convert it back so that in the end we can study still the functions. So generally, that's the idea in a nutshell. And then at the end of the day, then we're going to do usual VAR. And then we're going to use this VAR, the forecast errors. Now we have 7 of them. The red ones are related to functions. And then use that to identify these structural shocks. Now we have a 7 structural shock because we are using 3 functional principal component to approximate income distribution. So then we can this B matrix is telling us how these shocks will influence aggregate variables and the function. So we're going to identify using this isometry we have. So although we do everything in this three-dimensional space to represent income distribution, we can recover this functional response of income distribution to these shocks. Okay, so now with that, we're going to identify now I'm showing you how we identify this growth targeted redistributive policy shock and equity. All we are doing is that once we identify these functional structural shocks, we just have to find a weight so that we can find a linear combination of them to achieve our policy goal. The first one is to achieve 10 years later, we want to find out this combination of this functional income distribution shock, which will give us maximum aggregate output. That's how we identify this growth targeted shock. And then we identify green shock, this equity targeted. Here, policymaker will target Gini coefficient 10 years later that you computed from income distribution. If our policy goal is to minimize inequality, like Gini coefficient 10 years later, then you will linearly combine in this particular way, and these weights will give us this the GM equity targeted shock. So now let me show you how this growth targeted shock will change the income distribution. So if the policymaker want to have a maximum output 10 years later, then the policymaker should find a way, it could be through subsidy or tax or other public policy, to decrease income distribution, decrease poor people up to, this is a 1 percentile, 10 percentile, 25 percentile, 50, 75, 90, and 99 percentile of income distribution. So this growth targeted policy must reduce people, the poor people, but increase lower middle people and decrease upper middle, and then increase these poor, very rich people here. So now I'm going to represent this using the histogram. So now it's the same thing, but I'm summarizing this information in an easy to see histogram. So the blue bar shows you 10%. It's a before. So these percentiles are computed with the income distribution before the shock is given. So these blue bars represent 10%, which is the proportion of people in this 10 decile group before the shock. But now after the shock, you see that the enormous decrease in the most poor people, and then also the next one, 20 and 30s, right? There's a keep decreasing, but you see a lot. Oh, I'm sorry, this is the next one. So I am going back to this growth targeted. So this one is, you see the very, very huge decrease in most poor people, but increase in this lower 20, 30, 40, 50%, but then the decrease in 60, 70, 80 percentile, but increase in the rich people, the 90 and 10th, the last. So again, if we summarize into further the quintiles, then the blue bars are 20%, but you can see how this policy shock should decrease bottom 20, but the increase next one and the decrease. So this is how, if the policymaker really want to maximize output 10 years later, that's what the income distribution change this policymaker should achieve. And now if we go to the next one, this is the case where the policymaker is interested in inequality. So he or she want to minimize inequality 10 years later, then this is how the income distribution should change at impact. So this is again 1%, 10%, 25, 50, 75, 90. And so you can see that you have to decrease people below 50%, but increase people above, but decrease seriously the most rich people. So again, the same plot here, 10 deciles before the shock, everywhere you have 10%, but now with this shock, you're going to see huge reduction in poor people, which is same as growth targeted, but what's different is that you have a huge decrease in the most rich people. But if you look at the middle part, it increases upper middle, not lower middle, but it decreases lower middle. So this is the further summary. So you can see the enormous reduction in this, but also reduction in rich people. So this is the contrast that we're going to see this. If the policymaker is growth targeted, this is the kind of change we want to have at impact. And if they are interested in minimizing inequality, then this is what you're going to have here. Okay. So now I'm going to show you, now that I identified this shock, I'm going to focus on empirical results. So I'm going to show you how impulse responses, these are the conventional results, and then I'm going to show you the new results, which is the distribution effects of monetary policy and also effects of this redistributive part, both two redistributive policy, the growth targeted and equity targeted. So let me give you the big picture, and this is what you're going to get. This is typically a macroeconomist look at when if they want to study effect of aggregate policies such as monetary policy on this output. This is a price, and this is commodity price, and this is interest rate, and this is income distribution. And each column is showing you how each of our structural shock, output shock, which is again unexpected change in output, unexpected change in inflation, and then commodity price. And this is really the fourth column is what you need to look at if we want to study the effect of monetary policy. It's going to hurt. So now this is going to be the contractionary policies, the increase in monetary policy. It will reduce aggregate output big time, as this is well known, and then it die out, the monetary policy. So this is from the ad impact through 120 months, which is 10 years out. So horizontal axis will tell you the time from the policy action date. You can see, and this is well known, and it's going to reduce price. It reduces commodity price. And this one is really showing you that this contractionary monetary policy really increased, and then the effect is dying out. And then the last one is really showing you how this monetary policy shock affects income distribution. And this first one is ad impact. This is showing you where how the monetary policy shock will affect monetary income distribution, this, and the 1 year later, 2 years later, and 10 years later. And then we're going to study how this growth targeted shock here, the last column, will affect output. As I said, it has a huge positive effect on output by construction. But this is also the impact on income distribution at impact date, and this is what we discuss. This is how shows the nature of this shock, and then how it changes income distribution from the impact 10, 5 years later, and 10. So this is what we're going to study in depth. So let me first look at the monetary policy. So this is a distributional effect, and the ad impact 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, and 10 years later. This is the two-dimensional slice of this impulse response service that you have seen. So ad impact, and I'm giving you two-dimensional slices from here in this first column. Oops. And then I'm going to make it histogram so that you can see better. So ad impact 1 year later, 2 years later, 5 years later, and 10 years later. You can see that this decreases poor people and decreases rich people too, thereby and increases middle income group. So this is the directly, totally, purely redistributive effect without worrying about the negative effect on output. So this is what I meant by the monetary policy. If you can somehow preserve aggregate output, then you will achieve improve inequality. You can see then the effect is pretty persistent. You still see this income inequality reducing effect even after 10 years. But the last column here is showing you what happened if you take into account the negative impact. If you go back and look at this monetary policy decrease, if you increase interest rate, output will suffer, which is shown here. And this is from over the 10-year horizon. And this is what I'm showing you here in the last column. So you can see that from 1 year on, inequality goes really bad because poor people increases. Because level effect, if average income go down, then poor people will get most severely disadvantages, right? Which is showing here. But then the effect is not permanent. By 5 years, you can see that this effect's gone. But this is clearly there, and this, the aggregate impact is much bigger than this purely distributive effect. That's why what I meant by overall, the redistributive effect that the monetary policy can achieve is small. So this is what I have explained so far. So on the income distribution, so on the macroeconomy, if you increase interest rate, output will suffer. And the income distribution, if you can somehow control and preserve mean level, then we're going to have a income inequality reducing positive redistributive effect. But if you don't, then you will see very negative effects. So I summarize that in terms of Gini coefficient. So this is if you can fix if you don't have a negative mean effect, then the Gini coefficient go down, and this is pretty persistent. But if you take into account the negative effect of aggregate output, then it is going to go up. But the effect is, fortunately, it's not that persistent. After 5 years, it dies out. But the magnitude of this Gini coefficient increase is much bigger than increase in here. So this is basically the summary of what happens if you increase interest rate. There is a large negative effect on the average income, but there are if you can somehow preserve that income level, then if you can focus only on redistributive effects, and this one is really improving income inequality because it reduces low income group and also reduces top income group. And the effect seems to be, although small, it's persistent. Okay, now let me talk about the redistributive policy, which is first I'm going to talk about growth targeted. So that effect, again, I am showing you the surface. Again, let me show you, although remind you, I'm looking at this fifth column. So this growth targeted shock will increase income output substantially and very persistently. And then it will change income distribution in this way. And again, I'm going to show you two-dimensional slices here. So this is the two-dimensional slices from our impulse responses at impact 1, 2, 5, and 10 years later. So now, if you don't consider this the mean, remember there's a very significant and persistent positive impact on output. But suppose if you don't consider that, and I am just translating the function into this histogram, and this is a 10% mark. So before the shock, everybody was at this 10%. The dotted line show you. But we saw that this shock will reduce very poor people and reduce the upper middle people, but increase lower middle and increase top people. But then as time goes by, it changes. But in the end, it's going to, in the middle of the road, after 2 years, actually the it improves the inequality. But then that effect goes out. And then later, 10 years later, you see a little bit of income inequality kicking in because you see increases in poor people and rich. But now, interestingly, if you take into account that huge positive effect on output, you can see that after 1 year, you already see improvement in inequality. You decrease poor people without decreasing rich people. And that is pretty persistent, peaking the positive reduction in the poor people is largest after 2 years, but still without reducing middle and rich people. But then the lower poor people portion is increasing or slightly increasing, and you see that 10 years later it's gone up, but again without decreasing rich people. So this will show up if we look at the Gini coefficient. Now, if you don't look at the positive impact on output, you still see Gini coefficient going down, improving inequality, but that effect goes down after 5 years and becomes insignificant, and you do see glimpse of increase. And by the way, this gray area shows you confidence interval. So darker one is a 68% and lighter one is 90% confidence band. But now, if you look at the big positive impact on output of this growth targeted shock, you see huge reduction in Gini coefficient. And then although it is increasing, but still significant even after 10 years. This is really, to me, it was really, really surprising that because often we hear this trade-off between growth. If you go growth, inequality will suffer, but it clearly shows that it's not the case. So as I said, this output targeted shock is actually, it increases output sharply and the effect is substantial and persistent. And then the monetary policy shock tend to increase interest rate too, because the mechanism here is because we have seeing substantial increase in output, then they may worry about potential inflation out of that. And income distribution, as you saw, it has a huge impact on inequality, both with and without, and especially with output, positive output, it is really huge, as I show you. And now I'm going to show you the impact, how important, if you remember the questions that I posed at the beginning, that I like to show that our model allow us to see which shocks are important, explaining our aggregate variable, again, output, inflation, the price and commodity price and interest rates, and also income distribution at the 1% poor people, 25%, 50 percentile, 75%, and 99%. And then overall at bottom 25, middle 50, and top 25. So let me show you the first thing that I found is that this income distribution, this output targeted shock, which is the dark purple here, it is affecting output more than monetary policy. If you look at this, this is again 10 year. So this is the time from the impact date of the shock through the 10 years. So 1 to 5 and 10 years. By 10 years, you can see that this redistribution shock is actually affecting output much more than the interest rate, monetary policy shock, and commodity price and inflation. It's almost as equal to, as the output shocks. And it is true to also commodity price. And also it has a non-trivial effect on federal funds rate, the monetary, the policy. But now, if you look at this income distribution, this growth targeted shock, actually it explains a lot about these most poor people, like 1% and 25, and much less on the rich, these middle, upper middle people, and little more on. And then the monetary policy shock on the other hand, the green one, it has much bigger impact also on low, but much less on the middle and the high income. On the other hand, the commodity price, like oil prices and things like that, have more on here. So, and then this pink light one is the income distribution shock, but not captured by output. Okay, so the income distribution is driven by 3 shocks, but this purple one is one particular linear combination of that gives us maximum output 10 years later. And I also like to show you the impact historical decomposition. So now we can see historically how these 5 different shocks, output shock, price shock, commodity price shock, and monetary policy shock, and output targeted. And this light purple one is a part of income distribution shock, but that's not captured by output targeted shock. And then the gray area is just the impact of initial conditions. So this tells you at historically how much each of these shocks that we are considering is contributing to output, prices, and commodity price and this. And also we do the same thing for the how these shocks affect the most poor, bottom 25% poor people, and the middle 50%, the middle income group, and the top. So since for the sake of time, I like to tell you, focus more on income distribution. If you see this brown, blue, yellow, and green, they are the aggregate policy. So let's forget about this policy shock, but these brown, blue, and yellow, they are non-policy aggregate shock. Output, price, and commodity prices. These shocks have been historically increasing proportional bottom, the poor people, but decreasing middle income group, but increasing top people, top 25 people. What does it mean? That means historically, throughout the history from the beginning of 80 to 2015, these aggregate non-policy shocks been contributing negatively to income inequality. On the other hand, if you look at these purple, dark purple ones, that's the output targeted redistribution policy. Historically, except for the very early part of 1980, it's been decreasing proportional bottom 25, but increasing middle 50%, but also decreasing upper class income group. Meaning, historically, it's been helpful, improving income inequality. Improving. So I think this has a lot of information. And also this is really what is telling me, and what one of the conclusions that I made earlier is that if you are really interested in reducing income inequality, you aggregate policy is not enough. And monetary policy is not, it's all over the place, and the effect is very tiny, the green one. We really have to do this redistribute policy. So this is really what I am summarizing from what we have learned from the the impulse responses, and also especially in the historical decomposition. So the non-policy, like changes in output price and commodity price, that worsened the income inequality throughout, at least in the US from 1980. And then interestingly, these blue effect of inflation, price shock, so therefore inflation actually has been contributing biggest contributor of the income inequality, because they are most big time increasing bottom and top. So inflation, especially we experience inflation, especially in recent years, and we know there is a negative impact on income distribution from here. Then if we want to mitigate the negative impact, I mean, we saw that especially after COVID, serious inflation everywhere in the world. And that certainly clearly shows that it has a negative impact. Then how would you mitigate that impact? And this dark purple line is giving us an answer. One answer, it's not the only answer, how we may, if you are interested in mitigating the negative impact on inequality from inflation shock, for instance. Okay, so then let me focus on the equity targeted redistribution shock. This is when the policymaker is interested in inequality. So particularly this shock is identified with a policy goal that wants to minimize Gini coefficient 10 years later. Then the income distribution now has to change this way, as we went through, and it decreases people below 50%, especially the most poor people, but it increases upper middle, but big time decreases the most rich people. If you do that, then I am going to do the same thing here. Now, instead of GM shock, I'm going to have output. Instead of output targeted shock, now I'm giving you the equity targeted Gini coefficient minimizing shock. Everything else is the same, but you have now new one. So I'm just focusing on this one. This one decreases output, but not much, but not that significantly, but it increases output after like about 4 years. Okay, so it's not, if you are targeting inequality, not necessarily output will suffer. It will suffer at the beginning, but not much, but not too significant. But you see that it recovers, although not much. And this shock doesn't have much effect on prices. Oops. But it will have effect on income distribution. So I am going to show you two-dimensional slices of this. So this one is the two-dimensional slices, and then this is the histograms from there. And again, this dotted line is a 10%. Before the shock, every group has a 10% of the population. But now with this shock, you see huge reduction in both the most poorest and the most rich. A lot more on the most poor people. And the reduction, although not much in the lower middle, but significant increase in upper middle. But then it lasts. But then the effect is getting smaller after 5 years, and it is almost none. So the effect of this is not that persistent. But now the third column will increase. Remember the change in income distribution here? At the beginning negative, but it becomes positive, and it's going to be reflected here. And you can see that still with that, you will see these income inequalities going down because you see reduction in this. But then later, you see that these poor people are increasing, but at the same time, we see upper middle and the rich people increasing. So this is going to have a positive impact on Gini coefficient. So let's look at it. So if you don't look at output, the changes, then Gini coefficient will go down big time. But it's going to come up. As we saw here, we saw that this reduction in the inequality, it flattens out by 10. And then we're going to see Gini coefficient computed from here. And this is bigger. And then it's bigger, almost as big as this. But the effect, we see some inequality kicking in here because we see the rich people, but it is not much. Still, it is negative. And it is, more importantly, it is persistent. So, which is not that surprising. I think what's surprising is, this part, because of this output, you see this, overall Gini this inequality targeted, the redistribution policy shock, actual Gini coefficient positive effect is much bigger than what people thought. It's not dying. It is because of the positive effect in the end, it is lasting. Okay, so you can also do the same thing. This one is to see what shock is important overall, explaining output, price, commodity prices. But you can see that it is still non-trivially important for output and the commodity and the federal funds rate, but it has nothing to do with the inflation. But then the effect, as you may remember, it's much less than the growth targeted. But if you look at the income distribution, now its effect, now we're looking at first 25, 50, 75, 99 percentile of income distribution. You can see that its effect, the dark purple line, is important throughout, but importantly, it is important for upper middle and the rich people. But you can see that this growth, the inequality targeted will affect income distribution at all levels, but these effects on this, it has almost zero impact on inflation, which you may compare with this one. You know, growth targeted also doesn't have much, but it has some. But you can see that, but its growth targeted shock will have much more substantial effect on aggregate variable. That's what the contrast that I was making. And I'm going to, so this is finally, I'm going to show you the historical decomposition. And I'm going to also focus on this, its effect on bottom 25, middle 50%, and top 20. But you can see that the purple one's effect is larger on bottom 25, but the effect is, surprisingly, this is actually increasing poor people, at least historically from 80 to until the global financial crisis. But then during the crisis, it's very surprisingly, it is increasing poor people, bottom 20, but decreasing middle people and increasing upper middle. So up to global financial crisis started in 2007, this inequality minimizing shock, unfortunately, it's been contributing negatively to inequality by increasing poor people and rich people and decreasing. But during the global financial crisis and those recovery period, it actually decreased poor people, increased middle, and decreased rich people. So during the crisis and the aftermath of the global financial crisis, it has actually contributed positively to improving inequality. But after that period, it is becoming again, increasing inequality. So we certainly need more to study. Okay, so that was my analysis, and let me conclude. So overall, the contraction in monetary policy, again, if you monitor the central bank increase interest rate, it worsening income inequality, mainly because it has a large negative effect on aggregate output. However, if the policy maker can use policy tools to maintain the current level of aggregate income, it can have a positive and persistent, although not big, significant and a positive and persistent redistributive effect that improves income inequality. On the other hand, shocks to income distribution, which is redistribution or policy shocks, actually, if you policymaker targets growth, which is policy goal is to maximize output 10 years later, say, then it is actually have a much bigger and significant impact, which is persistent on output and also inequality, as you saw from the reduction in Gini coefficient. We saw that out 10 years time, and effect is much bigger than monetary policy. And another policy is the redistribution policy that we went through, which is inequality targeted or equity targeted, which is the policymaker is interested in minimizing Gini coefficient 10 years down the road. And by the way, target year can be changed. And that has significantly reduced inequality, which is not surprising. But interestingly, it does not hurt output. So with that, I will conclude. Thank you.
Thank you. Very rich and, a lot of rigorous work to explore these different interactions. And it is really interesting for us that you find that that monetary tightening increases inequality, because in India, the story is often told that you tighten monetary policy, you decrease inflation, which helps the poor, since the poor are worse affected by prices. But that chain doesn't really work because monetary policy doesn't have much effect on food, which is the major part of the consumption basket, and so on. So I think these other stories need to be brought out more. And also that even if you are doing a redistributive policy, it should be growth targeted. Then it has the maximum effects on reducing inequality. And here I just wanted to ask you that you have used really elaborate income distribution data. So if we can, I mean, you could also kind of, or if one were to think of doing such an analysis for India, if you can decompose the types of government spending, right? Bring in the composition of government spending, whether it's on infrastructure or on education, health, environment. Then what is the effect on income distribution and on growth, right? Or if it's just income transfers. Yeah.
Yeah. I actually, that's very, very interesting. I wanted to see both monetary and fiscal policy, but it is very difficult to get the, fiscal policy data are often it's available only at quarterly frequency. That gives us very few observations. Basically, each year we only have 4. So the mainly, and also at the time when I studied this research, actually, I gave a talk at New York Fed, and then I was talking to the deputy director of research division, and I asked him, what keeps you awake at night? What is the most important question that he got? So he got questions from New York Times and all this news media about it was like few years after the global financial crisis, and they were asking whether monetary policy is making inequality worse. So they got this question and they have to defend what they did because they are in central bank. So he said that because not responding is also a response. So he's really losing sleep over how to do it. So at the time, I was motivated. I wanted to do something to help them prepare intelligent answer to this criticism or from this media. So at the time, I was focusing on this, and at the time, I had this new methodology, and I wanted to make sure that I have enough data. So I focus on this, the monetary, but certainly fiscal policy is very important. But although I don't have that in this model, but as you can see, the effect on the even the growth targeted policy, and the monetary policy effect is very important, whether we keep the output at the current level or not. There, only the public policy through the spending or subsidy, right, or tax, you can do something like that. So to implement this redistribution policy that I just proposed here, we must rely on fiscal policy too. But I think your question is, I know it will be really interesting if I could have a model like this and have a tax variable and government spending, like various kind. It could be government consumption or government investments or military spending, things like that. Certainly, I mean that's in our to-do list.
Right. Yeah, your econometric contributions also to bring in the functional variables along with the standard VAR is very useful to bring in different kinds of data to the question. Yeah.
Yes.
So I'm sure PhD students who are on this call will get a lot of ideas to try and because you've done this analysis only with US data, right? So have you tried with other countries, or some of your students have different similar results?
Yeah, currently I am working with people in England, but they are the specialists on the wealth. So but still US, because US has the best data available. So we are working with the wealth distribution data, because the income and wealth. So the wealth inequality is, I think it's a very different matter. Inequality seems to be much more concentrated. The wealth is much more concentrated in not just top 1%, but top 0.1%. So analyzing wealth distribution is actually pretty challenging because wealth is so concentrated in so few people. So we are working on that. And certainly, and also I'm looking into Norwegian data because they also have very good the administrative data. So those are what I'm currently working on.
Right, but yeah, I think this lesson that you bring, that the standard view is that monetary policy, whether it's loosening or tightening, helps the rich and hurts the poor. And you are showing that income effects, job effects, all that, once you take it into account, then the story is much more complex and nuanced, right? Now we have some questions on the chat box. Can you see the chat box? Is there any question you want to pick up? But Charan, Charan, do you want to come in first?
Yeah, I just wanted to take from your question, Professor Chang, I was wondering, you're from Korea, and I always keep talking about Korea in our country. Now, when Korea was passing through the growth phase, the high growth phase, do you think that the income inequalities had widened very strongly? And now we are thinking about China. Did income inequalities widen very strongly in China? And would you have some, now that you've done your research, would you have some recommendations for these high growth countries during that phase, exactly where our fears are, during that phase to contain the widening of income inequality?
Well, I think again, I don't have research yet, but I think if you see the shape of income distribution of a growth targeted, you see huge reduction in very poor people, but you see increases in the lower middle. I think through these government policies, subsidy to help them get education to improve human capital, eventually, I think. Through the education and investment in human capital, through the subsidy on education or whatever public policy you can do, which South Korea did. It was mandatory that everybody has to have first 6 years of education. There was a mandatory, which I think was very important. So I think that will then eventually increase growth, and then the growth in aggregate economy will affect, as you saw, further reduction in inequality. And I think that this gives us a possible plausible path to achieve both growth and reduce inequality. And then the how to implement initial income distribution change, right? Reducing the poor people, thereby increasing lower mid people, so that everybody, you see that the people in the bottom 10% was almost gone, right? And they are moved up, so that everybody has at least a little bit of resources to get some education, invest in human capital. And I think, and then through that, you see that it will have an impact. And then what's amazing is that that policy didn't reduce people in the upper middle. Later on, it picks up those. So I think that's a one observation that I made. I don't know whether I fully answered your question. If I didn't, please ask me.
No, Professor Chang, you're right. In our country, we are assuring food security to a great extent. And we have also
Yes.
come out with the poor people's insurance schemes. So most of the time, the money is lost in food and health. To that extent, we are supporting the lower income group and saying, okay,
Exactly.
let's raise that. We are attempting that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that the policy to reduce the most poor people can include money to buy the essentials, right? Food and shelter, and then in making public education free for little kids and things like that. I think that's really what prepares everyone to contribute to growth, right? Yeah, I totally agree.
But there's a general worry that technology is really concentrating income at the top, right? Even in the US, you have the big tech firms and you have software and technical people who do much better than the middle class and so on. So in that sense, growth increases inequality.
Yeah, that is really, really important. How all this AI-aided growth, they are certainly putting money into rich people, and then they are spending a lot. That's why if you look at aggregate level, the output may not be suffering because they are consuming a lot. So we really have to do more careful studies about consumption by different income group. So we might be, there may be an illusion that we don't see reduction in GDP because the rich people are consuming and the poor people are still suffering and not consuming. And I think this is important because everybody has to contribute for us to maximize growth in the future. And then what we do with these most poor people who don't have means to invest in their health and the human capital is going to have a very very long lasting effect, I think.
Right. And I think when we see that, you can't depend on exports so much in today's world, then you have to have your own domestic consumption supporting growth. That means more equality and spending power becomes very important. Now, I think we turn to the questions in the chat box. Somebody is asking that how to adopt a growth strategy based on low-income people. Growth targeted policy.
Yeah, I think so. The growth targeted distribution, the policymaker will see how he or she should change income distribution, and clearly it tells you that you have to reduce the poor people. So then, as we discussed, then that growth targeted policy must come up with some ways, public policy to reduce poor people, right? Reduce people in the most poor people group. So that will be through this food subsidy or tuition waiver for public education or making it mandatory, things like that. I think we already, it's very important part, how to achieve that, right? I just show you what kind of distribution change you have to have a maximum growth 10 years later. And then that, if you look at the distribution, it shows you that the policy must reduce the people in the lowest decile, right? The most poor people, and then the policymaker have to be creative about coming up with more detailed policy, the implementations, right?
There's another question which says that developing countries want to take a growth targeted policy, but inflation and employment sort of short-term issues become more important. So this idea that is a short-term consistent with the long-term growth policy.
So this is why we look at this VAR, which tells you the effect, not only at impact, but it shows you, I show you for over 10 years time, 120 months. So the inflation, as we saw, that was an important driver of increasing inequality, right? But the shock to the price level is inflation, right? The positive shock to inflation, the price level is inflation. And as you saw, that shock increases bottom 25%, but decrease the middle class and the increase top. That means inflation is bad for inequality. It is bad for inequality, therefore, but we found that this output targeted shock is consistent, although not much, although much less than the impact of inflation shock, it is really persistently improving inequality. So we really have to mitigate. Redistributive policy will mitigate the obvious negative impact of inequality, inflation.
Right. So you need policy to counter those other policies to counter the short-term impact. Then there's a question of what should be India's long-term strategy for combining growth and improved income distribution? Your advice.
Well, I don't know whether I can say it, but at least, and also my paper is just telling the policymakers, if you are growth targeted, if you want to maximize output, then you want to think about how to change income distribution. And this is my study is giving the suggestion how income distribution should change now, right? So remember, that's the figure, lowering the poor people, but increasing the rich people. But there was a composition in the middle. You increase lower middle, but decrease upper middle. So I suggest that that kind of change is what you should achieve. And then I show the consequence of that on inequality. Gini coefficient is going down and it is pretty significant and persistent. Then the policymaker now, I mean, you can take the growth targeted, but then this policymaker has to come up with a specific policy, whether it's a subsidy, tax, things like that at the beginning.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if we keep talking about the middle class, how important it is for the middle class to increase, the industry is looking for that also as a source of demand. Then there is a question from someone who has done a study, Ranjit Singh Human, who has done a study of 180 countries. And he says that his data suggests that unemployment and inequality have either increased or remained stubbornly high. So what is your response?
Can you say that again? I'm sorry, I didn't
Yeah,
hear.
it is there on the chat box. What he is saying is that he has studied 182 countries over 91 to 2009. And he found that unemployment and inequality have both either increased or remained stubbornly high. What is your take on this? That in general, in most countries, both unemployment and inequality have increased.
So, I mean, so from my studies, if you don't do anything with the redistribution policy, if you leave everything on aggregate shock, like change in the monetary policy included, the changes in output inflation, output shock, inflation, commodity price like oil shock have all contributed positively to increasing inequality, right? So, I mean, I don't have unemployment measure here, but at least inequality. So I'm not surprised that they have seen that. At least we see that in the US, but I think something similar may be happening. So these aggregate, what's happening in aggregate economy, like output price and commodity prices, have contributed even in the US, negatively to income inequality, meaning it increases inequality. So I think I haven't done cross-country comparisons, but I'm not surprised. And that's consistent with what we find here.
Any other question? I think we're through with the chatbot questions. Anybody wants to make a comment or has a question? So it was a very interesting discussion, and I think some very relevant policy implications. Charan, you want to take over?
May I?
Yeah.
Thank you, Chair, for taking my question first. My second question to Professor Chang is that probably monetary policy, fiscal policy, and growth will also be there. But at the same time, we are seeing that AI is going to displace 46% of the global workforce, as has been found out by IMF in 2024. That is one. Second, how will we make the people partner in development? When the peoples are not partners in development, how can we imagine that inequality will decrease and unemployment will decrease and growth will, I think consumption-led growth economy will have to be factored. If as has been raised by Professor Ashima Goyal, consumption constraints are very, very serious constraints. So where is the role of monetary and fiscal monetary policy particularly? I see very little role in that, but fiscal policy certainly is having, and as has been already pointed out, the welfare distributive system, as we are in India, more than 82 crores people we are giving food, grains through PDS and all that. I think I was just reading the paper of the Panagaria, Arvind Panagaria, in just last week's EPW. He says that growth has decreased extreme poverty, agreed. Multidimensional poverty is still there. Second, he says India's central challenge is no longer the eradication of extreme poverty, but the attainment of broad-based prosperity. This is the challenge, and how the monetary policy can address this challenge. Thank you.
Well, that's a lot of questions. I don't know whether I have answers to all, but overall, I agree that the AI technology will increase inequality further. That's, I think, it's inevitable. I think I agree with many people, and it is because it is through many things. It's replacing conventional workforce, so increasing inequalities, and it will certainly concentrate all the wealth, and the consumption will be distorted, because people will produce things that will be consumed by these super rich peoples. So I think we're going to go into these superstar models. But what you can do is to think hard about redistribute policy. So what's happening? Like AI is certainly a shock, aggregate shock, like it's an output shock, right? Aggregate technology shocks. As we saw, these aggregate shocks, including aggregate policy, they are mostly increasing inequalities, right? Then we also saw evidence that the good redistribute policy can mitigate. So I only was able to show you 2 examples, but consistently it showed the reducing especially the growth targeted. But we didn't see that for the inequality targeted. So if we are interested in this growth targeted, although small, it is consistently reducing the inequality. So I think we have to face the fact that inequality will rise. It will get worse if it's not better through this AI. Then the only thing we can do is to do redistribute policy, and the monetary policy shows some potential. If we can maintain the aggregate level, it was improving inequality. And as you said, the fiscal policy may have even bigger effect, which is yet to be studied. Then we can design redistribute policy more directly with the fiscal policy, which I hope may have more, persistent effect on reducing income inequality. So I think you are right. Then we have to make sure that everybody contributes. But then the growth targeted policy reduce the most poor people in a way through these subsidies and the other benefits, automatic stabilizers, food stamp and other things, and free education. Through that effort, we are making somebody to become someone who has more potential to contribute. I think this policy will touch on your concern, making everyone contribute in this era of AI and machine learning. I don't know. Again, this is a very important, very big question. But if I infer just from what I found, and that's what I can say. And I did try some fiscal policy in this framework, and I also saw some potential there. And I think people should also study more using this kind of the framework, which allow you to see how whole distribution changes. I mean, I cannot do so many at once, but if anyone is interested in implementing our methods, I'll be happy to share codes down the road.
Yes, you're absolutely right.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
There's one more question come in, which talks about this composition of fiscal spending in India. I think you're being exposed to a lot of issues we debate in India. So what are called freebies, but many governments promise at election times all kinds of, there are special transfer of money through the electronic UPI schemes to women, etc. So these are called freebies. So the question is that how useful are freebies? So you just give money to people, right? To maybe a targeted group, compared to other kinds of government spending, which could say education, health, etc. So will they affect negatively as they increase costs and raise public debt?
I think when you are spending public money, I think you usually have a clear target. We don't want anyone hungry, so then you can give like food stamps so that the money can be spent on purchasing food, not on other things. Like in the U.S., people worry about policymakers worry about people using their money to buy drug instead of food, for instance. So maybe if there are worries about people not using money for the intended use, say buy good food and stay healthy, that's too. And the money, instead of giving money to you go to school, if it's a small kids, you just pay school directly without giving them money and the risk some chance that they may not do it. So you can make it mandatory that they go to school. And then if it is for poor people but older, then you may give money so that they can pursue something. So to further improve their human capital to contribute. So I think it depends on the policymakers' concern and what kind of worries that you have in terms of actually achieving the intended policy goals. So just giving money to everybody, I don't know. they may or may not work, but I think if you have a clear goal, then you try to make it, you know, so you want to induce more disciplined use of the money toward the achieving policy goal. That might work better. I'm not so sure because I haven't really implemented policy and evaluate the performance. And it depends on the
Yeah.
people's attitude and cultural backgrounds too.
Yeah, you don't want it to be a kind of bribe to vote for people, you know.
What?
And in the Indian election in one state, we saw this. There was one party which was in power, which was giving all kinds of gifts, you know, just
Yeah.
freebies, free things to everybody. But they were totally neglecting infrastructure. So the other party came in and promised, you know, this is the last chance to develop. We want to spend to. And it was the people who were getting all this free money, they voted for the party that was promising infrastructure. Because after a while, just money is not enough. You know, you want better jobs and growth, which comes
Yeah.
with more productive use of money.
Yeah.
So
I mean,
anyway, thank you very much. And we really enjoyed interacting with you. Charan, you want to take over?
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Chang, and thank you very much, Professor Goyal, in setting the context and bringing out the issues that we in India are facing, especially the case that you just mentioned, the freebie. Professor Chang is being educated of what happens in an emerging country. And when they are trying to grow, how you try to sort of band-aid the income inequalities. So many times I think in our country, female labor force participation is very low, just about 30%, vis-a-vis the global average of 60% and neighborhood average of about 80%. So most of the political parties before the election will give women lots of money. Many times I think it is because of the educated women who have given up their jobs just to take care of the family. It is a freebie, but I think it's a very well-deserved. And I would be very happy if women are given, the ones who have given up the jobs for their families, they're educated, if they are given on a monthly basis some amount of money for the sacrifice that they have done for the country or the family. So this is one, but as Professor Goyal explained, freebies could also be very politically motivated and could be they come around that corner only during elections, and therefore there's a budgetary cycle which follows a political cycle, sadly. In any case, the discussion has been so rich. Professor Chang, you brought in the technical part so beautifully. And then I really liked your graphs and I really liked your pictures. And the way it brought out, especially the last three pictures where you explained how we were able to narrow the before COVID and after COVID, I thought that was very intuitive. But the way you derived it technically, as Professor Goyal said very rigorously, really, I think something our students in our country would like to learn. So thank you very much for sparing time, being with us, and making such an excellent presentation, which combined the rigor and the policy. Thank you for that. I also want to thank the participants who have enriched the discussion. Now, special invite to you, Professor Chang. Next week, on Friday, we are having from Korea a discussion on Korea's growth model and how they grew so rapidly and what is there for us to learn in India. So I'd invite all of you to please join us even in that session. I'm sure it's going to be very, very interesting and very, very absorbing for all of us who are on the path of Viksit Bharat. With that, just last quick announcement. The recording of today will be available on our website by noon tomorrow. If anyone wants to share with others, most welcome to do it. Have a great weekend. Once again, thanks to you, Professor Chang. Thanks to you, Professor Goyal, for enriching our knowledge. Thank you. Have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.